Oman has committed itself to an ambitious leap in the quality of scientific research and development through sustained funding and support for applied scientific research. By 2040, it envisions a society of individuals who are creative, innovative, globally competitive. This requires a shift from studying the building blocks of life to imagining their breakthroughs and applications to real-world challenges. The 10th edition of ViewPoints, Sohar International Chairman's Forum, in its 5th virtual session, initiates a dialogue with one of the world's leading voices for scientific inquiry, Dr. Robert Dijkgraaf, Director and Leon Levy Professor of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, USA. He is a renowned scientist and mathematical physicist, and an impassioned advocate for using scientific knowledge, creativity, imagination, and out-of-the-box thinking to overcome the challenges facing humanity today and tomorrow. Let us explore the future of science and technology.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Happy New Year. Happier and healthier 2021, God willing. Thank you for joining us today for 2021's first ViewPoints Forum. Scientific temperament and a spirit of innovation have been fundamental drivers of human civilization. What started with primitive inventions like stone tools and the humble wheel millions of years ago had led to modern day wonders, such as blockchain, artificial intelligence, and 3D printing. The importance of science, technology, and innovation in today's world can hardly be overstated, as they are a key determinant of economic development, a source of empowerment, and a force for social welfare. Oman is a country has had an illustrious history of innovation, from the Aflaj irrigation system, which dates back to 500 AD, to traditional dhows that negotiated hundreds of miles of rough seas with ease. The country is working on reviving its century-old tradition of innovation and scientific outlook. In a momentous decision, recently, the Basic Law of the Sultanate incorporated education as a right of every citizen, and it aims to enhance the scientific approach in thinking, developing skills, and encouraging innovation. The law guarantees freedom of scientific research, supports scientific institutions, and promises to nurture researchers and scientists. ViewPoints, as a platform, has consistently endeavored to encourage and inspire Omani youth and entrepreneurs by exposing them to global personalities and futuristic concepts. Today's session on the future of science and technology builds on that promise. Before I invite our guest speaker, I would like to highlight a few points. You can engage and join the dialogue by typing your questions in the designated Q&A box displayed on your screens, preferably with your name and designation. We will try and address as many questions as time permits during the latter half of today's virtual session. On that note, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Robert Dijkgraaf, Director and Leon Levy Professor at Institute for Advanced Studies, Princeton, one of the world's foremost centers for curiosity-driven basic research. A renowned scientist and mathematical physicist, Dr. Dijkgraaf is a leader in science policymaking and a trained artist. He has served as the president of the Inter-Academy Partnership, a consortium of more than 130 of the world's national science academies. He has also co-chaired the Inter-Academy Council, the global alliance of science academies, which advises the United Nations, World Bank, and other international organizations He has co-authored The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge, a book on how basic research and original thinking are essential for innovation and societal progress. Robert, thank you for really taking the time to do this. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for this wonderful introduction, and good evening to you all. And what a great pleasure to be with you. And I really look forward to visit Oman in person soon. And I'm also particularly delighted that I have the opportunity to talk about this important theme with you, the future of science and technology, certainly given the ambitious plans and goals that Oman has set itself, which is all very, very exciting. So I want to start with my presentation. And let's start with a kind of a simple question, what is technology? And there are many interesting definitions. Jokingly, sometimes it's said as everything discovered after you were born. Certainly, I think my children think of Wi-Fi and the internet as I think about electricity and running water. Technology also everything that doesn't work. But of course, more seriously, it's the dominant force that shapes and changes both nature and culture. And remarkable thing, it's in some sense already bringing the future to the present. My point today is that the future is already here, but it's in the minds and the laboratories of our scientists. Now, as I said, I wrote a little book co-authored with Abraham Flexner with the wonderful title, The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge, because it's often remarkable that the most impactful, the most applied, the most useful inventions and discoveries are made by people who are just intensely curious and do not have use forwards in their minds. And in research, there's this distribution where there's a long tail of curiosity-driven transformative discoveries and theories that have great intellectual depth, but are kind of high risk, but of course also high rewards. And these moments determine to a large extent the course of history. Well, there's a famous story then when Michael Faraday in the early 1900s was doing his experiments with electricity and magnetism to the amusement of the public. The Minister of Finance, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, came and visited and asked him, what is the use of all this? And Michael Faraday answered, well, I have no idea, but one day, sir, you may tax it. And of course, now we pay all taxes on our electricity bills. Now, to peek in the future, I briefly want to bring you in the past. And we will go to the New York's World Fair, which was held in 1938. And as its theme, it had the world of tomorrow. It was an occasion to peek into the future. There were very many interesting innovations. The first television was shown. In fact, the first live television broadcast was President Roosevelt opening the World's Fair. People also saw the first fax, the first washing machine, the first robots. Nylon was introduced, superhighways, many interesting concepts that are now all around us. But there was also a scientific advisor, and that scientific advisor was Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein gave a speech about the future of science. But he didn't mention two things. He didn't mention nuclear physics, and he didn't mention computers. Both of them would very soon after this determine the course of the world. And remarkably, both were developed in his own scientific institution, the Institute for Advanced Study that I'm now speaking to you here in Princeton, New Jersey. In fact, very soon after that speech, in August 1939, Einstein wrote his famous letter with Leo Szilard addressed to President Roosevelt, advising him to start what would become the Manhattan Project and the development of nuclear arms. And there was a group of great mathematicians at the Institute, among others, John von Neumann, Alan Turing, and Kurt Gödel. And during the war, von Neumann writes, I'm thinking about something much more important than bombs. I'm thinking about computers. And his interest in mathematical logic led him to produce and build the first modern computer with the so-called von Neumann architecture, again here in Princeton at IIS. And remarkable, at that time, in 1946, when we started building it, as a history of that project writes, there were no tangible assets relevant to computer developments. There were just books, brains, prestige, and high hopes. So out of completely useless matter like nuclear physics and mathematical logic, within a few years, both the atom bomb and the modern computer were born. Now, what is there left to discover? And I always like these kind of ancient maps. These maps, they have some part that is mapped out. You can see land. I think that's the metaphor for our present knowledge, our current science. And then there are the big unknown, and there are all these sea monsters depicted there. And I think that's the unknown. That's the thing that, you know, in the old days, explorers had to dare to travel into it. So one interesting question is, what do we know that we don't know? And I'm a theoretical physicist, and physicists are very happy. They know exactly what they don't know. If we look at the energy content of the universe using Einstein's theory of relativity, we can determine that only 5% of the universe is known to us. All the matter and particles and energy and light that you can learn here on planet Earth is only accounts for 5% of the content of the universe. The remaining 95% consist of very mysterious dark matter or dark energy. And these are the modern equivalents of our sea monsters. We have no idea what they are. But, you know, in fact, you know, if you look at the world at large, our unknown knowledge, the dark matter, so to say, is much larger because, you know, science becomes easy at the very large and at the very small. If you study the smallest particles or the largest structures in the universe, we have very simple equations. But the real difficulty is in the middle, where it describes everyday life, which is a matter of great complexity. And here I would argue we are on a turning point of history. I feel that we can characterize the 20th century as the century that found the building blocks, discovered the building blocks of reality. And the 21st century will be the century where we start designing using these building blocks. As a metaphor, here are two children's toys, two little toy cars, one made from metal and one from Lego blocks. What's the difference between these two toys? Well, if you go after a few weeks, the left one will still be a car, but the right one could be turned into a plane. The great thing of knowing what the building blocks are is that you can start building, you can start designing. So this image that we study nature and we know some part of it, and there's the great unknown, what we know we don't know, is a vast underestimation of what can be done. Because it's not only about what we can find in nature, it's what we can possibly make ourselves in our laboratories. The number of forms of life and matter that we find in nature is only a very small fraction of what we can actually produce ourselves. For instance, now all of us are the lucky winners of a cosmic lottery. That is to say, our individual DNA has been chosen to build a prototype, that is us. But of course, of all possible DNA codes, that's a completely negligible, infinitesimal small fraction of what could possibly be built. So what are the Lego blocks of reality right now? I would say they come in three categories. In life, it's genes, it's DNA, it's proteins. In matter, it's atoms, molecules, particles, the fundamental constituents of matter. And in information, we have learned that bits and codes and algorithms are the fundamental building blocks. Now, quite remarkably, in all these three domains, recently, we had absolute breakthrough technology. In life, we saw the advent of genetic engineering through CRISPR. In matter, we are starting to enter the era of quantum technology, using the technology that nature itself uses in its atoms, but now to build our machines. And information, we are entering the era of artificial intelligence, neural nets, and deep learning. And in fact, these three developments, as I will show, they actually reinforce themselves. Synthetic biology, quantum technology, and artificial intelligence are reinforcing the three of them. So we have this triple helix of spinning technology that's rapidly accelerating. So just remind you how long this kind of took from the building blocks to design. It's almost 70 years ago that the molecular structure of DNA was discovered. We found that, life, like our life, is written in a book, basically of 3 billion letters, 20,000 genes. If you want to visualize it, it's a library of 3,000 books. It took 60 years to discover it, to decode it, to read it, to understand it. And now we're finally at the stage where it can be rewritten. We are in the age of omics, of genomics, of transnomics, of proteomics. There's big data in life science. Life now looks like these kind of very quantitative axes. And if you think about it, the amount of information in the life sciences, if you take all the current digital information in the internet, it could fit in 1 gram of DNA. If you use the DNA in 1 gram to store information. The information in the internet doubles roughly every 2 years. The information in the life sciences doubles every 6 months. That means that everything that's known about life and medical, 3/4 of that was found and explored in the last year. And this was pre-COVID. In fact, the development of the coronavirus vaccines is a very good example. This is technology, the mRNA technology, that could only have worked by understanding the genetic basis of life. And in fact, this particular approach was more than 25 years of very intense lab work that then was ready there. It was on the shelf. It could be used in developing these wonderful vaccines that we have right now. In fact, very important element is this capacity to edit our genes, the so-called CRISPR technology. And interesting enough, last year, the two co-discoverers of this technology, Emmanuel Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna at Berkeley, were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for that. And genetic engineering will bring many, many things. It will bring personalized medicine, gene therapy, more and more diseases can be addressed in this way, bioengineering materials. And of course, now we also have to add many things in the COVID domain to these applications. Now, coming to the second element, if you think about technology and matter, there's this wonderful lecture by the physicist Richard Feynman, again, almost 60 years ago, but more than 60 years ago, where he says there's plenty of room at the bottom. He makes the point that in principle, there is nothing that speaks against the possibility of maneuvering things atom by atom, building machines atom by atom, just as we ourselves, our bodies are built out of atoms and molecules. In fact, we closely are going to there. On the latest Apple chip, which is not as big as your thumbnail, there are 8.5 billion transistors. That is to say, on that chip, there are more components than there are human beings on the planet, all squeezed in your thumbnail. In fact, I want to, just for amusement, show you this little movie that IBM made in 2013. And it's made by manipulating individual gold atoms. So what you see here is the smallest possible movie ever made. And the little dots that you see are individual atoms. Of course, this is totally useless, and the only reason why IBM made this is because they could. But just shows you how micro technology is developing, how fast. And I would say now we see this confluence of life technology, the technology of life and the technology of engineering, basically happening at the same scale. And this is something quite exciting because it will bring the greatest power that's there in physics, the theory of quantum mechanics, to bear upon ordinary technology. Now, quantum mechanics was discovered more than 100 years ago by a small group of physicists that were struggling to understand the fundamental laws of nature. They didn't have any application in mind. Nowadays, it's estimated that 30% of our economies are based on quantum mechanics. I'd like to add to that 100% of reality is based on quantum mechanics. And this will rapidly increase because we will see in the coming decades many quantum sensors, quantum computers, basically everything in your life at some point will be a quantum technology. Now, one of the remarkable things in quantum mechanics is that you can do many things at the same time. We all know Schrödinger's cat, that's both dead and alive. And so that means that you can have enormous efficiencies using quantum technique. So this is a little animation come from a lab in Delft, and it's trying to find your directions in a maze. And if you do it in a classical way, you have to try every possible venue and a possible path one by one. But if you're a quantum computer, you can do all of these at the same time. So in the time of exploring one path, you explore all of them. And it's a very rapid way to find the solution to this problem. The point is that when we're using classical computers, most of the problems that you want to use computers for, their complexity is so large that it will take longer than the age of the universe to do this calculation. But quantum computers, since they can speed up exponentially, they can do this actually not in exponentially long times, but polynomial times. So many problems become now realistic, calculable problems. The current quantum computers are very small. They have only 50 qubits. They're very similar to von Neumann's computer that he built in 1946, which had 1,000 transistors. And again, your iPhone has more than 8 billion. But the wonderful thing of quantum computers, whenever you add a single qubit, say a single quantum transistor, its capacity doubles. And so again, in the last 2 years, we saw remarkable breakthroughs. In 2019, Google announced the first working quantum computer. It did a job that it took 200 seconds that a classical computer would have taken 10,000 years. And this year, in 2020, a Chinese lab announced that they did something similar, now not using solid state techniques, but using light, using photons. And so these things are rapidly developing. And there's something of a Cold War going on between the US and China, and who has the most powerful quantum computer. Now, this is interesting because another thing that we are seeing, we see the strength in computing power, and we see also a strength in growing data. In fact, the number of data in the world is growing much faster than our computing capacity. And we human beings can be easily overwhelmed by so much data. But actually, these computers love data. And so they are actually surfing these big waves. And that's why we are entering this new world of artificial intelligence. Now, perhaps you know about Moravec's paradox. And it's a very wonderful paradox. It says that things that are easy for human beings are difficult for computers. And things that are difficult for human beings are easy for computers. That is to say, for us, it's very difficult to multiply two numbers of 1,000 digits. A computer does it in an instant. For us, it's very easy to play soccer. Every child can do that. For a computer or a robot to play soccer is very difficult. And that's because in the past, computers and human beings were very different. Computers worked on algorithms. You knew exactly what they were doing. They need no sleep. They were not complaining. And they had an open architecture. You can easily plug in a screen or an extra printer to a computer. So it had certain advantages. Perhaps the biggest advantage was that you knew exactly what the computer was doing. Human beings, our brains are very different. They work through neural nets. We can learn. We are shaped by evolution in the long run, but we're also adaptive. We can learn moment by moment. And the self-learning capacity is very different. So these were two completely different approaches to intelligence. But now computers are moving in the human domain. With deep learning, computers are exactly working and acting like human brains are doing. And this has led to incredible breakthroughs in pattern recognition, whether it's images, wonderful medical application. In fact, a lot of machine learning went in this last year in developing therapies and vaccines. We will see self-driving cars translations. And it's also remarkable that these self-learning machines are clever, but they're also creative. 3 years ago, Google had this wonderful machine, AlphaGo it was called at that time, that played the game of Go against the world champion. And in fact, in the end, the computer won these games, but something rather remarkably happened in one of these games. This was in game 2, move 37, where the computer put a piece, as you see, it's marked here with a little circle, on the 5th line. And there's even a proverb, I think a Japanese proverb, that says never go beyond the 4th line in opening moves. So the computer did something that looked like a simple mistake. And everybody who saw this was laughing. And then 100 moves later, this particular piece was in a brilliant position and allowed the computer to beat the human. So it's something that's called a cosmic move, something that was utterly outside the box and extremely creative. Now, the big question is, are these algorithms able to find structure in the great complexity that describes most of our interactions of society, of materials, of life? And so these are fundamental questions. Which problems can be addressed? How robust are they? Do they generalize? Can we understand these structures? And there's this wonderful series in the Wall Street Journal, which is called Careers of the Future. And one of them, they had the career of robot psychologist. And this was not a robot that would be a psychologist to human beings. It was the other way around. The question was, if you want to know whether one of these algorithms will keep on working, whether the algorithm is happy, whether the computer is happy, you will probably have to interrogate it very much as a psychologist is exploring the human mind and the human state of mind. So it's kind of interesting that in some sense, by moving into the human domains, these algorithms become almost as complex to understand as human beings. Now, I want to end with a more generic point, which I would like to call the exact usefulness of basic research and investments in science and technology. And there are several levels. First of all, I think it's good to emphasize that knowledge by itself enriches our lives. In that sense, it's very close to the arts. It gives meaning to life. We want to understand the universe in which we are living. We want to understand the human mind and its products. Then, of course, these transformative ideas generate new technologies. Think again about Michael Faraday exploring electricity and magnetism, and how now our complete lives are electrified. Then it develops tools and techniques that can be applied very differently. I'm a particle physicist, and particle physicists building these big accelerators, for instance in CERN Geneva, needed a new way to communicate with 10,000 people. And that's how they developed the World Wide Web and the internet as we know it. Then research attracts the best minds, and if they move into society outside academia, they will actually have a sharper knife, so to say. They have new ways to approach other problems. It's also good to emphasize that basic research is a truly international public good. It's something that, not a single individual, a single company, or even a single country can capitalize fully on it. It's something that we share, and it's to the benefit of all of humankind. And finally, of course, it drives innovation and startups. It gives rise to economic growth that we need in order to address other issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's like societal inequality, whether it's increased healthcare costs. We need economic growth. Now, it's difficult to put the right numbers on this, but the European Commission estimated that if you increase 10% of your R&D investments, this will lead to 1.1 to 1.4% increase in GDP, which means that it has a multiplier of at least 5 to 7. A good example is MIT, the famous university in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It estimates that it has generated 30,000 companies with a total of almost 5 million employees, giving an annual revenue of $2 trillion, which would make MIT and its spin-offs the 10th largest economy in the world. Another example is the famous grant, the $4 million grant that the National Science Foundation in the US gave to Stanford University to digitalize their libraries. This actually led to the creation of Google, or now Alphabet, which has a market cap of 1.2 trillion. So you can think of that this single investment of $4 million had a multiplier of 300,000. So I think we should be aware of the tremendous impact that basic research can have and the driving force that makes this do. And I would like to come back to Einstein, because one of my favorite Einstein quotes is the following: imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited to all we know and understand, while imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. I think we are in a very exciting time where most of what's can be discovered is not yet discovered, but I think that in the coming century, we'll make dramatic increase in our knowledge and really to the benefit of the world. So I think we should keep the spirit of Einstein alive. And one of the greatest pleasure I have as director of the Institute for Advanced Study, where Einstein worked for the largest part of his life, is that if children write to Santa Claus on the North Pole, I have no idea where their postcards arrive. But if they write to Albert Einstein, they actually come on my desk. So 2 years ago, I got this wonderful postcard, I think from a very young child, I estimate 5 or 6 years old, who writes to Albert Einstein, "I hope you will never stop being curious." And I think with these words, I want to wish you all that have attended this seminar that you will never stop being curious. Thank you very much.
Robert, thank you. That was very enlightening and stimulating. Your last point, which I really want to ask you about, because I really saw that Einstein Dream Lecture, amazing lecture that you give to students, which looked like 12 to 14 years old children. And you were really going through some meaty stuff about gravity and science and technology and space and some of Einstein's equation. So my question really twofold. One, so that's a great idea to interest the next generation in science and technology. The question is, what more can we do as countries, as governments? And secondly, specifically, and this is tying it to one of the public questions, is how can we train students to think creatively and critically?
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful question. So I think it's indeed a fact that every child is born with a great amount of imagination and curiosity. And the remarkable thing is that some of the things that are most distant, like thinking about black holes or the universe, they are very close to the mind of a child, because they are the beginning of their lives and they really look into the future, and they're much more interested about what is not yet understood and what's about there to discover. So I think that's a great force. Unfortunately, I think in education, often that natural curiosity is being dampened. Of course, there's the confrontation with reality, and you also have to learn how the world works, how society works. But I think it's one of the challenges of education is keep that spirit of curiosity and imagination alive. Because often I think we realize, if we are teaching our students at universities, that we have to restart their natural curiosity and their interest. Now, one thing I also noticed is that any scientist or engineer, if I ask them, what was the first moment when your interest was triggered? What was the spark that created the fire? It's never a textbook or something. It's something very different. It might be a visit to a museum. It might be something they've seen on television. I remember when I was small, we had boxes of chocolate sprinkles that on the backside had biographies of scientists. So you're 6-year-old, you're eating your sandwiches, and you certainly are confronted with science. So governments have to start early they have to make sure that the products and the sparks of science are everywhere. And I think it's also very important to make children aware that science and technology is something that you can do. It's not something that you can absorb. It's something that you can shape yourself. It's an activity. And in fact, as I was making the point, I think the great challenges in the future is not so much learning about this, it's actually creating. So I think that's why we need perhaps even more creativity in the future, if only because doing complicated calculations will probably be done by computers. And so we have to build on our strength, which I think is the unique human ability to be motivated by what's around us, but also to have, think outside the box and have new ideas.
Thank you. So the next question is from the public. It's said COVID-19 showed us that not enough had been invested in fighting pandemics or its cure. How do we identify futuristic areas of importance in which governments and institutions should be investing in?
I think that's an absolutely key question. And I think, I myself, I think and most of us were really surprised how fragile our world is, how we could be hit by this pandemic. Let me say that one thing that the positive thing is, of course, that we were able to develop and break a record-breaking speed these vaccines, where we're totally based. It's interesting, the vaccines that are actually now being employed, they're totally new, they are innovative, that we haven't had these mRNA vaccine. But I think one of the big risks is that we now will look at the world through this pandemic, through COVID, for the next coming years. This was in our blind spot, and there are other blind spots. I think what we need is actually a global monitoring system that keeps track of what's happening in the world, not only with diseases, but also with things as water, food, energy, of course, climate, all of these issues. And there's no apologies here, because I think the technology is there. Certainly, I think, with the digital technology to build these systems. The thing that's lacking, and that I was really disappointed about, is that science was actually able to work globally to address this issue. But I think the world at the political level was very much working against each other, was not cooperating. So I think there are two things we need. We need much closer cooperation, also at the scientific advice level. And in some sense, we need a global warning system. We need a radar screen that picks up these things, and that will inform governments. And these global warning systems are typically very weak. They're underfunded, and countries are not contributing their fair share. So I think that's something that I hope the world will learn a lesson.
And another question is about, what do you think are most important challenges of quantum tech or nanotechnology that will be soon be resolved, and in particular operating at higher temperatures?
Yes. So there are many challenges in quantum computers. I think there are a few things that we should realize. That right now there are several kind of technologies that are being tried out. I think the world is investing in different scenarios. It's not quite clear which of these will be the winning one. So one thing we'll see in the coming years is probably a winning platform. But at this point, I think we have to invest in many different fundamental technologies, whether it's solid state or it's topological quantum computers or photons or whatever. The second thing is that it's kind of wrong to think of this as an aim to build a universal quantum computer. What you actually are doing is building quantum technology. It's the same as if you introduced electricity. It's not like you build a universal electric machine. You build all kind of tools based on electricity. So we get quantum sensors, we get dedicated machines. I think we'll soon get quantum computers that can only do one or two tasks. They're specially built for that particular task. And it's interesting the mentioning of right now, most of these computers work at very cold temperatures. One of the, often it's said that the killer application of quantum computers will be quantum computing. That is to say, finding new materials that then can be used to build more efficient and more practical quantum computers. So one of the key applications, I think, will be, I talked about exploring all possible forms of matter and life. Well, it's very difficult to build all of these as prototypes in the lab, but computers, in particular quantum computers, will be able to search in this vast space of possibilities and find the kind of materials, the life forms, the algorithms that we need. So in that sense, they will, I think, exponentially accelerate this exploration of the unknown.
Another question is, it is important to separate meaningful information from accidental information as a way of handling big data. How to measure meaningful information?
That's a key question. So of course, there's this deluge, there's this flood of data. And the question is, what is the meaningful data inside it? And, and if you have an image, it's almost like this data you can think of as a space of very high dimensions. And the question is, can you reduce all of that to some core where I would say the meaning is, and perhaps there where the fundamental laws reside? Now, it's not obvious, that such meaningful core exists. But I would say there are a lot of indications, particularly I think like in the life sciences. Now, there is a tremendous amount of data in the life sciences, but we know that life operates according to certain principles. There seems to be, some design underlying it. It seems to be optimizing something. So we have seen, for instance, in understanding language, which is a good example, it's quite remarkable that, the understanding of words and the relationship of words apparently can be reduced to a space of only 100 variables. So in the infinite space of natural languages, that seem to be kind of a solid core. And in fact, these algorithms are perfect suited to find these. So I would turn things around. I would say that we will see very important applications of AI and deep learning in those fields where such a meaningful set exists. If it doesn't exist, we might simply looking for something that even our machine learning algorithms will not help.
Robert, the next question is about how to manage, since R&D investment is a key contributor to tech innovation and eventually the GDP, is the current economic outlook expected to pose a challenge to the tech evolution or revolution?
No, I don't think so. I think actually what I see around the world is that people want to invest themselves out of this economic crisis. Partly funded, I think, by very low interest rates. And so I think countries are taking serious the economists that say that, investment in science and technology actually have a very steady rate of return. The thing is actually that you have to approach your R&D portfolio a little bit like your financial portfolios. And that means that you have to have a certain risk budget. And I think countries have to both invest in immediately applied research, but also collectively as a world. We have to make sure that we invest in these very high return, high risk enterprises. Of course, you can't predict which of these investments will be the key one and will generate all these revenues. But I think if you have a well-balanced portfolio, you should feel very comfortable. And I think this is something that every country is starting to realize that, and I would almost turn things around. I think there's not a country in the world that's not worried about how it can finance the needs of its citizens in the coming decades. Because many things we'll have to address climate change. We have to address higher healthcare costs. we somehow have to increase productivity. And I can't think of any way to increase productivity otherwise than by better educating our citizens and using R&D to produce new tools, new techniques, and in the end also new economic growth.
Well, the next question takes your last point further by really asking how to create a research ecosystem.
Well, I think it's the wonderful word here is to use ecosystem, right? Because an ecosystem is something that has many components and they're interacting with each other. So I think it's important that key for a good working ecosystem is biodiversity. So such an ecosystem should have many components. I think it's unwise to have like a monoculture, invest all your money in one particular task, and because I think that actually is just a very unsound investment. So I think you need a good balance between both applied and fundamental research. You need a good balance of the different kind of academic disciplines. I think it's quite key going to the future that we, often it's sad, the world has problems, the university has departments. So the internal structure of universities is not always very helpful in addressing issues. So you should also be creative, not only in your field, but also in the structures that you build. And I think for every country, particularly smaller countries, it's important to realize you don't have to do everything. No, it's you're part of this worldwide ecosystem. So make sure that there are a few elements where you are really excelling, and to create these peaks, which I think absolutely core. I would say there are two fundamental principles. Get the best people, so be very careful how you select them, and also then have trust and confidence in that they are able to phrase and formulate their own research goals. So this combination of very selective, but then actually creating space and freedom within, of course, a safe environment. That is, don't ask people, for their results after 6 months. Those who deserve this, who have a track record, should be given, I think, the flexibility and the long time horizons to build something. Because in the end, my experience is that in order to build such an ecosystem, the one thing that will attract talent to the system is other talent. So in the end, it's wonderful to have great facilities, great laboratories, great research funds. But in the end, I think it's the quality and the spirit of your colleagues that makes it successful. And a final point is that, there are very different countries in the world. They each have their own culture. I think that's a great thing. No, I think part of building such an ecosystem is also realizing what your own roots are, what your local culture is, and see this as a strength. And don't try to emulate other countries that have very different cultures. I think that's a great pleasure of being a scientist is traveling around the world and seeing people working on similar topics, but from a very different perspective, because they bring in their own culture.
I think that point is really good for the next question, is talking about institutes for research and what really differentiate research institute to produce the next Einsteins. And
well, it's. I think you have to be lucky. I feel, here at IES, we were very lucky that we were able, as our first professor, to attract Albert Einstein. So I like to say we have 90 years of steady decline, because it's impossible to top that. You could actually ask, why did Albert Einstein come to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, but at that point only existed on paper? And actually, Albert Einstein, he was, of course, working in Berlin, but he had a very particular position. He was head of an institute that only existed on paper and only had one employee, namely himself. So, one thing you have to realize that the people often who make the biggest contributions, they are like rare flowers. they need special environments. Now, there are certain orchids that only can live, in a very special microclimate. So in order to find these exceptional people who, by definition, if you're an exception, you do not fit into the system. So I like to say, I often joke that my working principle is that not fitting into the system should also fit into the system. It's a bit of a contradiction, but I think you have, as an institution, if you really want to make these gambles, and you should have, as I just said, fully trust in these individuals and be willing to create an environment that's perhaps very different and will support those individuals, but not others. So in that sense, it's a task not of every individual institute, but it's more a task for the world. Are we able to create spaces like that, that can produce talents of that form? And one thing I feel very strongly about is, I haven't emphasized, that I think we living also in exceptional times, that only very recently we can say that the full world is engaged in these activities. That is to say, we can now try to tap in all the talent that's there. And I always felt, very sorry to know that in past centuries, there were many Einsteins that were never seen as being an Einstein and had no opportunities to be developed. And so that's something that, we're in a much better situation. So for one thing, we need many of these places, and we need that every region in the world has to have this drive to find the diamonds among its population, those minds that are able to change the world and set them free. And I think will be to the benefit of all of us.
Robert, this question is from Franklin Wang, and it says, von Neumann like to think about how economics is a subject and similar to physics. How important do you think interdisciplinary studies are to us?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I think they're extremely important. Sometimes I joke, if you want to make a puzzle, jigsaw puzzle, I always start at the edges because that's the easy thing. The middle is much more difficult. And I think, our disciplines are the edges of the jigsaw puzzle. It's where studying just a molecule, you're a chemist. If you study numbers, you're a mathematician. If you study an animal, you're a biologist. But of course, they're all coming together. And von Neumann is actually a wonderful example who was able to mix all of this in his mind. It was remarkable that he was both a mathematician, a physicist, a computer scientist, economist, and he moved from one idea to the other. He moved from the mathematics of game theory into economics. Then he built a computer and he started doing economic models on the computer. He did weather predictions on the same computer that he used to build the hydrogen bomb. So I think we need to create environments for people like von Neumann. And I think here in Princeton, he was really able to do so. He was facilitated in this. So I think actually it's a great time these days to be fluent in more than one language of science and to combine these various points of view. And one thing I see, particularly with the younger generation, they don't really identify themselves as much as a physicist or a mathematician or a biologist or an economist. They much more define themselves through the problems that they're interested in solving. And, they have a toolbox and they try to use every tool they have. So that's, again, a great challenge for any institution, whether it's a university or research institute or government. And particularly if you create new structures, I think we need structures where there are not many internal walls, where people can fluently move from one to the other.
Robert, this question says business and economy is more dependent on AI and machine learning in today's age. So what should be the role of human beings in this emerging order?
That's wonderful. So I know when the chess player Garry Kasparov was beat by the IBM computer Deep Blue, people said, "Oh, is this the end of chess?" And he said, "No, no, no. It's from now it's man and machine against man and machine." So he thought, we should see this just as an extra layer of our own intelligence. I think it's good with the current hype also about artificial intelligence to realize that the current methods, the deep learning methods, have been extremely successful in certain areas, but also pretty useless in others. So it's not clear that this will be the answer to all of it. I think actually it can liberate us and realize that there are many problems in life where we do not have great data sets. As a human being, we learn certain things by analyzing. Only one example, a colleague of mine said that, he went to the zoo and his daughter saw a giraffe, and it was the first time. And then the next day they went to the Natural History Museum and there was a skeleton. And the daughter said, giraffe. So she recognized the skeleton of giraffe. She only saw one giraffe. An AI algorithm has seen hundreds of thousands of them. So human beings are able to start with very sparse data and still conclude something. I think the biggest lesson I've learned from the AI revolution is that I asked the Demis Hassabis, who developed AlphaGo and is himself a great chess player, how would he characterize the style of these AI machines playing games like Go or chess? And he said they play like teenagers. That is to say, they're much more adventurous. They think more outside the box. So I think we could be inspired by these machines to say, wait a moment, our great strength is our creativity, the possibility to extrapolate. And so we should invest more into that.
Robert, I want to give you the last 2 to 3 minutes really to say something to the youth who are watching you. What advice you have for them? How can they prepare for this new age that we're entering of tech and science and machines thinking and all that kind of thing?
So the thing I would like to say to the young people watching is that we need you. The future is yours. In fact, you are the ones that will have to do most of this. And that, you have a terrific force inside you. You have an engine in you. Because you know yourself when you are interested in something, when you're fascinated in something. So what I would say is, take that and explore that. I remember when I was a student in school and then went to study physics, I felt, oh, it's like I can now only eat desserts every day. Now I can really do what I like, what I feel I'm good in. And so I would say, explore that in yourself. Also, I try not to be intimidated by all the knowledge that's out there. I've seen and again that a young, fresh mind can look at everything the famous scientists have discovered and understand and look at it and say, well, this is not good. I can do much better. There's a very natural arrogance that comes from having a fresh look. And the remarkable thing is that time and again, science proceeds. So one thing you can be absolutely certain of, that you and your friends and your colleagues will make really dramatic improvements. The great thing of having a life in science and technology is that you can say that this time is the best time to do it. And you're always right, because it's growing and growing. So if you were living in 1960, people then felt it was the best time to do science, but the next year it was even better. And as I try to make the point, I think it's not, what I feel is that science is like a boat that has been traveling along a river. And now it's actually coming into the great ocean. So the number of possibilities using these new technologies, using these artificial brains, but also being able to connect around the world with all your colleagues I think is extremely exciting, and it generates many more possibilities than in the past. And perhaps the last thing I want to say, which I actually felt when I first was coming here in Princeton to the Institute. Now, often we think about our lives in terms of where we are born, what are our roots, what is our family, but you should also think about your life, about where you will end up. And one of my great pleasures when I first came here, I saw friends and colleagues coming from all over the world, but we recognized that we were driven by the same force, had the same ideas. And so we all felt that we were coming home. And I think that's perhaps one of the greatest pleasures that you can have, to find your destination. I think, we need you. We need your enthusiasm, your brains, your spirits, your imagination, your curiosity. But I think, one of the great rewards is that if you go into that path, you will find many others around the world, and you will be essentially speaking the same language. And you will feel that you end up somewhere that you will be able to call home. So bon voyage to all of you.
Robert, thank you. My gratitude to you for this impressive, stimulating presentation. Could not have been better, and I feel like you fell to the Einstein. We are going to go down now with things, and so thank you very much for taking the time and doing this. It's been fantastic.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I wish you and everybody in Oman around the world well in this effort, and looking forward soon, when all of this is over, to visit in person.
You will always be welcome.
Thank
and
you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us. Look forward to seeing you all in the next episode. Thank you all. Bye-bye.